Let's talk about a few names that we hear in this episode. I'm not going to go through every single name, there's a lot, but a few you should know, like Queen Elizabeth, obviously, but they also refer to her as Bess and the Fairy Queen. One thing I was thinking about with Queen Elizabeth is that Shakespeare grew up with her as the head of England for most of his life. When he was born, she was already queen, and I forget how long, maybe into his 30s before she died. So, like, can you imagine growing up most of your life, the same person, queen, and then suddenly have her gone? But for decades, this woman, and a woman, I think that's a very key point, is that the strongest person in the country, the most powerful figure, was a woman. Shakespeare had to reconcile that in his mind, that women and other people who are considered generally weaker, that they are capable of things as well. So I think that is something that shows up in his plays as these strong women figures, characters like Othello too, that they are capable of thought and just as equal and so on. But it's something to think about, that certainly would have influenced the quality of his ideas and his plays. Francis Bacon is mentioned. He was a government figure, but also he helped to develop the scientific method. But I think the reason he comes up here is that there's this theory that he was actually Shakespeare. He wrote the plays, and maybe he used this guy Shakespeare to help release them because he was a respected official and he couldn't release these trashy plays. I think most Shakespeare scholars nowadays kind of dismiss the notion that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare, or that anybody was Shakespeare but this person, actually Shakespeare, who was from the countryside. I don't have trouble believing that Shakespeare wrote these plays. He had a decent education, and the idea that he included things that he wouldn't know, I think it's important to remember that he was part of a theater group, and if he didn't know something, he could ask people, and he could get assistance in the writing. I don't expect him to have known every single thing. So all these theories about alternate Shakespeares, I don't really buy into. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, we've mentioned before. She is this sort of the L. Ron Hubbard of her day, running this Theosophical Society that really she just grabbed pretty whatever she felt like, including from Buddhism, Hinduism, the Upanishads, Kabbalah, and just creating her own system that seemed a little esoteric and from the Orient. So it was, I think the idea of reincarnation, popularizing that in the West, we largely can attribute to her. You can know that at the time when Ulysses was taking place, it was still pretty popular and respected in a lot of circles, so they'll mention it in this episode. George Moore is this other writer that they talk about. Here's a picture. W.B. Yeats I've talked about a little, but it's interesting how he doesn't show up in Ulysses. And I was trying to figure out where exactly was Yeats on June 16th, 1904. I haven't read enough biography information about Yeats, and I couldn't find it through quickly Googling. But if anyone knows, please let me know if we know exactly where he was. He doesn't show up in the book, but he floats over the book as a presence. He's referenced, and people know about him. I have this idea, because Joyce did respect him to some degree, that he didn't want to diss him the way he does, kind of belittle a lot of these characters, and I don't think they are necessarily accurate representations. I said that Richard Best wasn't happy with his representation. I think Joyce, he wanted to mock people a little and make them how he saw them or how he wanted to see them. So maybe he respected Yeats enough to not include him and just leave him in the background. Or it could be that he knew that Yeats was still a powerful literary figure and he didn't want Yeats to write something bad about Joyce. Now I want to mention a few other things that I discovered that are kind of uncanny. These are some interesting dates that I never knew about until now. So here's one. Hamnet Shakespeare, Shakespeare's son, who died when he was 11. By the way, Bloom's son dies when he's 11 days old. Let's think about that. But Hamnet Shakespeare, his baptism day, we don't know the day of his birth, but his baptism day was February 2nd. That's James Joyce's birthday. I'm not trying to imply any metempsychosis, but let me give you a few more coinkydinks. So Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, we don't know the date exactly that he died, I don't think, but we know the date he was buried, September 8th, 1601. Now, there's another date very close to that, the day that Shakespeare's mother died, Mary Arden. She was buried on September 9th, 1608. So they died on almost the same day in different years, about the same day. Now that date, though, may ring a bell because I mentioned it before. Molly Bloom's birthday, Bloom's wife, she was born September 8th, 1870. Now obviously Joyce chose that date, but why did he choose that date? So close to the dates of the death of Shakespeare's parents. Speaking of coincidence and chance, we've had these meetings, near meetings of Bloom and Stephen and Bloom and Boylan. They almost meet. What does that mean? What is that about? Is it, well, I'll just tell you what I think. I think it has to do, Bloom used the term fate and destiny a lot. I think, though, you can use other terms like the implicate order or the overall structure of things that are contained, that there's this hand of the puppeteer that is Bloom is almost meeting them because that Joyce is making them almost meet them. So he is acting as the puppeteer, and he's doing it because it serves the interest of story. But it also seems to be acting as this strange attractor, like a magnet or something that's pulling the filings towards it. Have you noticed that Bloom is being referred to as dark? There's this idea that he is the panther that we mentioned way back in Telemachus with the Panther Sahib, Haynes waking up in the middle of the night, Stephen having this dream. Stephen's dream we haven't talked much about, but he seems to know that evening, well, I don't know if he knows, but he seems to feel this force pulling him towards Nighttown, and he's going to have this meeting. He knows that something's going to happen that night. Way back in Proteus, here's what he says. After he woke me last night, same dream, or was it? Wait, open hallway, street of harlots. Remember, Harun al-Rashid. I am almosting it. That man led me, spoke. I was not afraid. The melon he held against my face, smiled, cream fruit smell. That was the rule, said. In, come, red carpet spread. You will see who. And in this chapter we get a little more of the dream. Last night I flew, easily flew. Men wondered. Street of harlots after. A cream fruit melon he held to me. In, you will see. Now the melon reference may be a little confusing or unclear at this point, but I will try to explain it later on. We have a few Stephen Bloom parallels. In this episode, Stephen says, I and I. That may remind you of Bloom when he said a while back, me and me now. There's another parallel when Stephen thinks buzz buzz. You may think, oh, that's a reference to Hamlet, but it may also remind you of the two flies in the bar that Bloom saw a while back. And notice, if you haven't noticed till now, Hamlet, how does Hamlet dress? He wears black. He's in mourning for his dead father. So too are Bloom and Stephen in mourning and wearing black. I found another recurring phrase, I can't believe I haven't mentioned it till now, Agenbite of Inwit or Eyenbite of Inwit. This simply means remorse of conscience. It's from a book or a text that is, I haven't read it, it's pretty not well known, but it's, I guess the significant thing about it is that it's written in a dialect of English. I forget from when it's from, like the 1200s or something. And it's a Kentish dialect of English, but essentially it just means remorse of conscience. Stephen, as he thinks about the past and his regrets, he'll think it occasionally. He'll go, Inwit of, or Agenbite of Inwit, or Inwit's Agenbite. Do you remember way back in the Editions episode of this series, I said that in this Scylla and Charybdis episode, there's a passage that you will not find in every edition of Ulysses. It's not in my edition of Ulysses because, I don't know why, but you can find it in the Project Gutenberg version of Ulysses. I'm going to read it to you if you don't have it. They're talking about Shakespeare, and he goes, "Will he not see reborn in her, with the memory of his own youth added, another image?" And then we go into his thoughts. "Do you know what you are talking about? Love, yes, word known to all men. Amor vero aliqui bonum vult undi et ea quae concupiscimus." And according to Google, when I put that in, it says, love is something which will be good for the things that we want. I'm not sure if that's an accurate translation, but the point is he does name love as the word known to all men, which in my version he does not name. How are we to take this idea that comes up in this episode that we don't need to pry into the private life of an artist to know their work? We should just know the work. When Joyce, we can't really understand Ulysses without prying, at least to some degree, into Joyce's biography. So I think Joyce is having a little fun with us that we need some biographical elements of his life. And for people like Shakespeare, for people like Socrates, Jesus, Buddha, and so on, that we don't have too much biographical information that we can rely on, I think the best way that we can know them is to know thyself, as the old saying goes. Because if Shakespeare did achieve any kind of reconciliation in his old age, I think it was, as Joyce describes it, he did incorporate all these creations as parts of his own identity, and being able to do that, he saw that they were all part of himself. I want to conclude with a final thought. On page 214 in my edition, there's this part that this guy Dowden, it goes, "Dowden believes there is some mystery in Hamlet, but will say no more." You really need the annotations for this whole episode, but I think this is a really, really important annotation. I'm going to read who this guy Dowden is and what he had to say. I think it is very relevant. Think about it in relation not just to Shakespeare, but to Ulysses and the larger structure and the way that Joyce delivers his ideas. Edward Dowden, he wrote a book called Shakespeare, A Critical Study of His Mind and Art. And in that book, there's this quote: "The mystery, the baffling, vital obscurity of the play," they're talking about Hamlet, "and in particular of the character of its chief person, make it evident that Shakespeare had left far behind him that early stage of development when an artist obtrudes his intentions, or distrusting his own ability to keep sight of one uniform design, deliberately and with effort holds that design persistently before him. Hamlet might have been so easily manufactured into an enigma or a puzzle, and then the puzzle, if sufficient pains were bestowed, could be completely taken to pieces and explained. But Shakespeare created it a mystery, and therefore it is forever suggestive, and never wholly explicable." When he says mystery there, I was thinking of Fergus, that Yeats poem, the Love's Bitter Mystery. So think of that in terms of Ulysses as a whole, and also in terms of reality as a whole.